Okay, I'm working on getting all of my systems up and running again for you all to hear. It is having slight difficulty with everything, but at least I'm going to try to restart my computer and play some PUBG while I wait and go from there. And why not have mic on as well? And camera on. Back. Done. Okay. It doesn't load as. Okay, good. Oh, camera's there, okay. So far, it's on the restarting stage. Which is okay. Oh, here it goes again. It had a very difficult time trying to start up today. Okay, this is having some errors with the camera settings. Ooh. Later. I want this game to be running. Camera off. Done. Loading game. While I load everything else on here. Let's see if Gamecaster lags out. Twitch Studios lagged out today. So if that lags out, then I'll be multi-streaming. Which I'm totally fine with. Ow! Okay, good. And I'm not totally sure if it's coming from the mic or from the actual phone for the actual mic setup. But who really knows? Okay, come on. We can load this. My phone is getting nice and warm as well, so. And my solo squad swiper on here. Okay, good. Yeah? Okay, I'll take one tonight. There we go. Okay, good. Resources, general. Okay, thank you for the host, very much appreciated. Okay. There we go.
So I want to welcome you all to our Monday morning safety seminar, where we do these safety seminars to go through the latest and nearest and dearest things within the construction safety world. This week we're going to be discussing scaffolding. But before I hit scaffolding, I just thought I'd give you a reminder, because we're all in the middle of this COVID thing. I'd bring you back to the COVID thing for a moment. We will not see, with the advent of means and whatnot. If you think it's going back to normal, it's only going partway back to normal. We will be having to use face masks or facial coverings throughout this season. I'm predicting right now the contract elements, the safety protocols, the guidance, different elements like that will not change greatly for us. We'll have to continue that 6-foot distancing in some manner and continue to wear our face masks as required, both by guidance protocols and by contract elements that are out there. But today, I want to hit the scaffolding and scaffolding requirements. I'll tell you, they got several key elements within the scaffolding piece. Several key elements. One being, and companies all set this differently, and we have to remember they set this differently, but scaffolding actually has a 10-foot fall protection requirement. Scaffolding has a 10-foot fall protection requirement. Now, some companies, and depending on contract and depending on what we're doing, some companies will set their fall protection requirement the same as they set their fall protection requirement based on general site-specific fall protection.
There we go. Full screen on that side. There we go. Much better. Requirements.
And those fall protection requirements are 6 feet for the use of fall protection in any arena. But scaffolding has a exemption to that and allows you to go to the 10-foot limit before using fall protection. Guardrail height within scaffold has to be the height of the top rail of scaffolds has to be between 38 and 45 inches. Top rails on scaffold, 38 to 45 inches, and they when the cross point cross bracing is used as a top rail, it's got to be between 38 and 48 inches. So when we're just using a cross rail as our fall protection piece, again, that cross rail or that intersection has to fall at about that 38-inch mark or greater, but not to exceed 45 inches. Mid rails, of course, are always between 20 and 30 inches. If I'm running a mid rail, 20 and 30 inches. Out there above the work platform. And then footings, and this is one of those pieces, particularly around this time of year, make sure and have proper footings in place. Footings support the scaffold, shall be level and capable of supporting the loaded scaffold. And again, the loads on those scaffolds have to be predetermined based on the load criteria and the labeling on those scaffolds, and we can't exceed that load. Tying back guys supported scaffolds with a height to base of more than 4 to 1 shall be restrained from tipping by guying, bracing. So when I'm setting them up, if I've got a 6 foot wide scaffold, I've got to start that tying back to the building or tying back to the structure somewhere around that 24-foot mark. Capacity is always identified on the scaffold by a label or whatnot, but scaffold components must support at least 4 times the maximum intended load. Suspension, when I get into suspension or drop down scaffolds, that jumps to 6 times its intended load. So it's got to be super built, i.e. to be able to hold that intended load that we're putting on there. And again, on normal scaffold like we use, framed scaffold, we're looking at a 4 times its intended load to be used there. Training, each and every person on a scaffold, employee who works on a scaffold has to know the hazards and has to be able to identify those hazards and has to be trained within that hazard realm and the hazards they'll encounter while they're working off that scaffold. Inspections is the #1 cited thing. When we start looking at inspections of scaffold, we should be doing a documented, and I'll say it one more time, we should be doing a documented inspection on that scaffold prior to use every day. So somebody, a trained person, a competent person, has to be doing an inspection of that scaffold before use every day. And that's got to be documented. And again, it is important that we do have that. And within that inspection piece, we should be looking at the planking to make sure we have no gaps in that planking. We should be looking at the footing, and I say especially this time of year. I was up on a site Thursday that we had our footing in place, but what had happened is the ground had thawed and dropped about 2 inches, and we had one corner of that scaffold that was in the sunlight that was actually an inch off the footing. So we've got to make sure, inspect, re-level, and make sure things are correct. And when we inspect, we're looking at not only the scaffold itself, but we're looking at access points, how we get on it, how we climb it. We're looking at the footings and making sure they're okay. We're making sure the scaffold itself is square and level. We're trying to make sure that our work platforms, again, no big gaps in our work platforms. You can only have a 1-inch gap between those plankings or those work platforms, no more than 1 inch gap in there. And then we look at our guardrails, 38, 45 inches on the top rail, and then 20 to 30 on the mid rail. So it's important to do an inspection. Also, we probably should be looking at, is particularly if we have ice or snow or whatnot on those work platforms within the scaffolding element. If we have snow or ice, that should be removed prior to the start of work, and it should be identified within our inspection sheet. We have, they hit on erecting and dismantling, and remember that erectors and dismantlers have to be trained to do so. We also got to be following a plan. There's got to be some type of plan to put this scaffold together. And whether it's put together, that plan is put together by an authorized person or a qualified person, really comes down to how we're putting it together. Are we going up more than 4 flights? If we're going up more than 4 flights, then that should be put together by a qualified person. When is a competent person required for scaffolding? And we get into that from time to time. What's the difference between qualified and competent and authorized? Let me try to make it simple. Authorized person is that person that the employer or owner defines as capable of doing this job. And that's authorized. And then we have a competent person that is authorized by the employer to do whatever project or whatever task they're asking to do, and task is important, doing whatever task, but also has the authority on a job site to actually stop that task or stop other tasks associated with that piece. Stop those in the time of a hazard or in the time of extreme risk. So they can stop it, start again, rethink it, and then go from there. And then we have a qualified person, and a qualified person is generally the person that is either by knowledge from time on the job, time within the job, or by a degree. And again, they have a deep sense of knowledge either by time on the job, time in the job, or a degree out here to support their qualifications and in what they're doing. So it's pretty clear when we're erecting and dismantling that a competent person must determine the feasibility of providing a safe means of access and fall protection for these operations. And there's a, within it, there's a caveat for erecting and dismantling that you don't need to use fall protection while you're erecting or dismantling, but that has to be determined by a competent person. And frankly, as we get up a flight, so as you start to go up a flight and start to work on the next flight, we should be putting those fall protection barriers in some fashion, guardrails, whatnot, in that flight. And we never work more than 2 flights ahead of that area that we have our fall protection in place. So that's an important piece to remember as we start to assemble those scaffolds. When is a competent person required for scaffolding? Well, in general, as we start to look at it, a competent person's required to select and direct employees who erect, dismantle, move, or alter that scaffold in any way. And sometimes as we set up scaffold, we'll change the design, we'll shift it over a little bit, we'll move it from its original intention, and that really should be done by either a qualified or a competent person. Also for training, when we start to look at training, all scaffold training should be done by a competent person as well. And that has to do with the erecting, dismantling, moving, operating, repairing, maintaining, or inspecting scaffolds to recognize those associated in work hazards. And I just said moving. And we'll get on it towards the end, and actually I think next week, those of you that are interested, you can pass the word. Next week we'll get into MWAPs, the mobile elevated work platforms. I think that's a good shift for us, especially coming off this scaffold piece, that we do get into some of the MWAPs. The mobile elevated work platforms, buckets, man lifts, that type of stuff, all fall under this whole scaffold regulation, and we should have a good understanding of that. So next week we'll jump into MWAPs and man baskets, scissor lifts, that type of stuff. The again, competent person required for training and required for inspections. And again, they reference, and we got to be clear about this, they reference inspecting scaffolds and scaffold components for visible defects before each work shift and after any occurrence, which could affect the structural integrity, and to authorize prompt corrective action. So again, a competent person, and then of course the competent person should be, if we're using suspended scaffolds, and we don't generally use those, from time to time you'll see them on bridge jobs, but when we're using a suspended scaffold, that competent person's also got to inspect the drive gears, the ropes, and the attachment points, how we're attaching it, in order for us to be lowered into that area. So again, competent person, and what we do with that. Qualified person, as I said earlier, qualified person, one who by possession of a recognized degree, certificate, or professional standing, or who by extensive knowledge, training, and experience. So qualified person is identified very clearly there. It's possession of a recognized degree, certificate, or professional standing, or who by extensive knowledge, training, and experience has successfully demonstrated his or her ability to solve or resolve problems related to the subject matter. The qualified person within this realm has to perform the following duties, and in general, design and load scaffolds in accordance with that design. The design of that scaffold in the manner with which we are going to use it. So that's a qualified person, and as well as the qualified person can do parts of the training, and those areas that they are very familiar with can train other folks to use or operate on this scaffolding. There is a caveat to all this, and it's when is an engineer actually required with scaffold. And the standard actually spells out two areas that you have to have a registered engineer design this scaffold. And one of them are anytime I am using a suspension scaffold, the engineer has to design the connection points where we're going to hitch this suspended scaffold off to, and how we're going to do it. The second side of it is anytime I'm using a prefabricated scaffold, which is what we generally use, and you exceed 100 feet, anytime you exceed 100 feet on a fabricated frame, we've got to have an engineer in there helping us or designing that whole system and what we're doing to include the tiebacks and how we're going to be using that scaffold in that manner. So again, that 100-foot mark defines, and if you remember, I've given you a couple numbers already. 100-foot mark, engineered. I also said if we go more than 4 times its base, at that point, we've got to start to tie it back in. Generally, that's about the 20-foot mark when we start to have to tie, or 24-foot mark when we have to tie it back into the building or to the structure. And then we have to tie it back in every 20 feet square, both vertically and horizontally. So my initial run of that tie back is 24 feet. 24 feet across the board, and that's all horizontal. And then from that horizontal point, it's every 20 feet. It's every 20 feet, both horizontal and vertically going up. And again, when we hit the 100-foot mark, it's got to be engineered for us to exceed that 100-foot mark. We take a look at other standards when we start to look at the whole scaffold standard, because it does kind of jump around. within the scaffold standard. And there's a couple other standards that it references and that it calls upon to provide us guidance within this whole scaffolding piece. And those other pieces, of course, are the fall protection standard itself. We can't tie off to a scaffold if I'm using fall protection or personal fall arrest systems. I can't tie off to the scaffold itself. That's number one. They also reference the electrical standard. When I set up scaffold in and around electrical conductors, power feeds, whatnot, I've got to remain 10 feet away from those power feeds or building feeds. So it references that. It also references within it the use of ladders and making sure to inspect your ladders and make sure your ladders are safe for use on or around these scaffolds. Remember, when I set up a scaffold, I can't use a step ladder on that scaffold. Step ladders or ladders are not allowed to be used on the scaffold as a working element from that platform base that we're on. So we have that. And the last piece they reference within that is the hand and power tool pieces. Hand and power tools cannot be activated until I am on a firm footing. Now, I do see as I'm standing here that somebody just sent me a text asking, well, how about stilts? Can I use a stilt on a scaffold? Yes, you can, Bill. You can use a set of stilts on a scaffold, but you've got to raise the guardrail equal to the height of the stilt. So if you're running a 40-inch guardrail there, and all of a sudden you're using 24-inch stilts, you've got to come up to 64 inches for your top rail and your mid rail. And if you were running that at 24, that mid rail's got to come up to 48. And then you still have to have that lower rail that was in place to begin with. So you can use stilts, but we've got to raise our fall protection guardrails to accommodate for that extra height that we just put in place because of the stilts. I hope that answered that piece. Capacities, when we start looking at capacities within these scaffolds and the scaffold elements, and I mentioned it earlier and I'll mention it again. Scaffolds are intended and built, and the components that we're using should be able to hold its own weight and at least 4 times the maximum intended load. And this is, we kind of get into, walk a very thin line when we start looking at loading those with the, when I have masons out there and we're loading them for a masonry use, they probably aren't intended to be used with a full block of masonry, In most cases, if you take a look, the weight of that block or cube of masonry exceeds our 4 times maximum load in there, and we should probably be running about 50% of a block every time we put those up on a platform. About 50% of the cube or 50% of the block. Now, there are some specific made scaffolds for masonry, and there are some engineering demands that are allowed within that realm. And generally we go to a mason's scaffold or we go to a heavy-duty scaffold to be able to accommodate that added weight. And that is, again, important to understand 4 times. But it really comes down to a qualified person has to design and put those in place if we're doing that masonry side. Scaffold components must not be loaded in excess of their maximum intended loads or rated capacity. And again, they come back to say whatever is less. The intended load or its rated capacity, whichever is less. When we look at platform construction, that working area that we're walking on a scaffold, each platform must be planked and decked as fully as possible with the space between the platform and upright to not be more than an inch. So I can't have more than an inch gap within my platforms or within my planking when put them. The space must not exceed 9 inches when side brackets or odd-shaped structures result in a wider opening between the platform and the upright. So again, I'm given 9 inches max in normal use when I set it up. And then we look at the, because we've all heard about this is OSHA planking, this is OSHA certified. I'll just tell you, OSHA does not certify planking, nor does it certify the use of planking. What it actually says is that it is OSHA compliant, which are 2 different words there. And if I'm using just planking and not the prefabricated platforms, but just planking, then it can't have knots, it can't have tears, cracks, any type of deformation within those planks, or it's not suitable for use on these scaffold platforms. Again, it's got to be capable of handling those loads that we intend to put on it. Solid sawn wood, fabricated planks, fabricated platforms may be used as scaffold planks, following the recommendations made by the manufacturer. So everything has to follow those. And when I'm setting, if I'm running planks, I'll always use a shiplap. So when I'm running planks across a scaffold, I'll always use a shiplap, and that's where we've got the overlap going in the same direction going down the length of the platform when we have multiple towers going up. When we start to look at spans of those, we like to keep them right around 8 feet, 8 to 10 feet. And when I'm operating in that, when I'm operating within that realm, I always want to have about a 12-inch overlap, 12-inch overlap over my frame. I want to be able to do that, and that overlap will always be in the same direction across that scaffold work platform. That platform now can't deflect more than an inch. So that platform can't deflect more than an inch. And I made that kind of easy based on averages, but the actual requirement is 1/60th of its span. 1/60th of its span. So if we got 60 inches, it's 1 inch. If I got 120 inches, a 10-foot run. If I got 120 inches, I could have deflection of up to 2 inches. But it's good when you're setting these up and you're working on them to be mindful it's a 1-inch deflection. At anything greater than a 1-inch deflection within that platform, I probably want to check it, and I probably want to catch it within my inspection criteria as I start that shift. The standard actually prohibits, and again, if I'm working with a masonry group or I'm working with a bridge group, the actual standard prohibits the cluttering or the housekeeping. It doesn't prohibit housekeeping, it actually encourages housekeeping. I can't have things cluttered across my deck. It's got to be kept fairly clear to prohibit any sort of tripping hazards or whatnot on that platform itself. Every walkway within a scaffold. So every working platform, every walkway, everything we're doing within that scaffold itself has to be at least 18 inches wide. When the work area is less than 18 inches, it's got to be protected with either a guardrail or personal fall arrest system. And again, 18 inches wide, normal working area. And at that point, I've got to have my fall protection in place. So if I'm using only half of a scaffold or half of a prefabricated scaffold, I've got to have some type of fall protection on the back side. Now, the front side can be open, of course, for us to do our work on that building or that bridge or whatnot. It can be open as long as it's within that 9-inch window. Now, Cecil can turn and ask me, well, what about the masonry side? If I'm doing masonry work, I can kick that back to about 14 inches, but I generally want to keep it as tight to that building as possible. Again, to keep things, or to keep me from having the ability to fall down through. The guardrails, I hit on the guardrail thing, but the standard requires employers to protect each employee on a scaffold from falling to that lower level. And for adequate protection, we're going to install guardrails along all open sides and ends before releasing the scaffold for use by employees, other than erection and dismantling crews. And again, I mentioned 2 flights ahead, you've got to have your fall protection in behind you. Guardrails are not required when the front end of the platforms are less than that 14 inches from the face of the work. Whenever I'm doing that masonry work and things like that. And then when outrigger scaffolds are 3 inches or less from the front edge, again, the outriggers are 3 inches or less, depending on the width of the outrigger, then my scaffold can be set up within those perimeters. And when employees are plastering, lathing, masonry work, they can go out to that 18-inch mark, so I stand corrected. Masonry work can go out to that 18-inch mark or less from the front edge. And then they talk about the materials that are unacceptable for guardrails. Just a reminder, and we discussed this in the whole fall protection piece anyway, but steel or plastic banding must not be used as a top rail or a mid rail. Again, steel or plastic banding. And remember, your rails, when we put these rails in place, they have to be able to withstand 200 pounds of pressure downward or outward, and they've got to be at least a 1/4 inch thick. So when we look at steel or plastic banding, it doesn't fall within those parameters. Mostly everything we are using is considered a supported platform. So within that supported platform, they can include your frame scaffold, your rigid supports, poles, legs, posts. How can one prevent supported scaffold from tipping? And we mentioned this earlier, and I'll mention it one more time. 4-to-1 base to top, 4-to-1 dimension, base to top, and height. And again, the first run's at 24 feet, and then 20 foot squares afterwards, vertically and horizontally, where we go from there. They do allow, in some circumstances, a 30-foot spread on that horizontal when we're tying back, but generally it's just good order to keep them 20 by 20 as we go up through. Footing foundation requirements for supported scaffolds, and again, supported Scaffold poles, legs, posts, frames, and uprights must bear on base plates, mud sills, or other adequate firm foundation. And then they get into this whole piece on using a forklift as a scaffold, or using a forklift in conjunction with a scaffold, or using a loader in conjunction with a scaffold, and trying to raise a scaffold up, or trying to work from a scaffold placed on a forklift. And part of the reason they start to get into this really has to do with that whole man lift piece, not the fact that we would see John or Bill up on a scaffold that's now on a set of forks. So I just want to reiterate, you cannot put a scaffold on a forklift or on a loader unless both manufacturers agree to that occurring. I cannot do that unless both manufacturers agree to using a scaffold from that unit or from that piece. The other side of it is, if an engineer says it's okay to put that scaffold on there, they are considered qualified in that manner and could do it. So we can't do that just as the basis of here's what we're going to do. The forklift piece, materials can be used to increase the working height, and I mentioned the whole stilts. Stilts, if we're using stilts, then again, you would have to raise your guardrails within those parameters. When it comes to access to scaffold and getting up and on scaffolds, anytime I have a break of elevation of more than 2 feet, I've got to provide some sort of safe access. And that safe access can be a ladder, a stair, a stairwell, whatnot. Again, when the scaffold's more than 2 feet above or below a point of access, I've got to provide safe access. And then direct access is accessible when the scaffold is not more than 14 inches horizontally and not more than 24 inches vertically from other surfaces. And this standard, again, prohibits us from climbing cross braces or climbing those prefabricated frames which are not intended for climbing. So the little 6-inch steps on the, or support rungs on prefabricated scaffolds are not intended for climbing. It's actually got to be a built-in ladder to that scaffold if we're climbing. You can also use a extension ladder for access on those scaffolds, as long as the ladder itself exceeds our landing by 3 feet. Ladder exceeds our landing by 3 feet or 3 rungs, and there is actually a determined access point with some type of gate or chain with which would be taken down while we access and then put back in place once we're up there. So we can use ladders, hook-on ladders, attachable ladders. I'm not supposed to use, and we've had this conversation a few times, but a step ladder is not intended as an access point. I cannot use a step ladder for access to a scaffold. Anytime I use a step ladder, it has to be in full open mode and not just leaned against something for access. And I can't use it in full open mode to leave that ladder to get onto the scaffold. So again, using a step ladder for access. I can use walkways, I can use ramps, and then again the integrated ladder on prefabricated frames. We can do that. Access for dismantling or erecting scaffolds, again, that's a little gray as we get out to that. Erectors and dismantlers are allowed to climb across this scaffold in a safe manner, predetermined safe manner that is predetermined by a competent person, and they have to be under the direction of a competent person while they're erecting or dismantling this scaffold. Standard prohibit any types of scaffolds. Just to let you know, lean-tos or self-built timber scaffolds we probably aren't going to use in and around what we're doing. There are some criteria if you want to use them. There is some criteria, build criteria out there in, I believe it's Appendix C, but I'm not going to dive into that in any fashion. The fall protection requirements for scaffold, as I mentioned earlier, the guardrail systems, personal fall arrest systems, D-rings, snap hooks, lifelines, anchorage points, vertical or horizontal lifelines may be used out there, but they can't be attached back to the scaffold. The only case when working from an aerial lift, you attach the fall arrest system to the boom or the basket, and within the basket, it's not just on the rail of that basket when I'm working within a man lift or a scissor lift. It's not just attaching something to that rail, it's actually using the predetermined attachment points which have been identified as those points which are capable of withstanding the load, be it a 5,000 pound load or a 3,000 pound load. And I reference those two numbers, but those attachment points, if I'm using personal fall arrest systems, it's 5,000. If I'm using a fall positioning device, i.e. a retractable, it can drop as low as 3,000 pounds. So again, understanding the fall protection requirements is very important within it. Different fall protection requirements for different types of scaffold. I look at aerial lifts, it's personal fall arrest system or arrest systems that have to be used. When I look at a chicken ladder or a crawling board, personal fall arrest system or a grab line, a vertical line, lifeline, that type of stuff. When I look at ladder jacks, again, 18 inches wide, and I have to have fall protection around that ladder jack as well. When I look at roof jacks, 18 inches wide, and again, fall protection of some sort on that roof jack, whether you're tied off or you're using a guardrail system. And when we start looking at ladder jacks and roof jacks, probably the guardrail system becomes cumbersome, and we've got to look at vertical lifelines that we can tie off with sliders on them, so that I can tie off to the slider and again work from that area. Remember, if I'm using vertical lifeline, there can only be one person on a vertical lifeline or attached to a vertical lifeline at a time, number one. And number two, within that, my slider or attachment point should always be at my head level or greater. My head level or greater. And if I'm using a personal fall arrest system with a lanyard working from that roof jack or that ladder jack, then I probably want as well to think about my fall distance. And my fall distance has to be figured that I am going to fall this thing is going to protect me when I'm falling greater than 13 or 14 feet out there. So we want to keep that in mind. And then whenever I'm using supported scaffold, I also have to have fall protection in place. And we talk about personal fall arrest systems, and personal fall arrest systems, and again, they reference this in their 1926 451 G1 standard. They reference that personal fall arrest systems can be used when the feasibility of using a guardrail system does not exist. So anytime I'm using scaffold, they want you to use the guardrail systems first, priority, guardrail systems, and then we can move to the personal fall arrest system if that's not feasible. They also reference under 451 H1 and 2 the falling object protection, and making sure that when we set these up, particularly when we start going a couple runs, that we protect that area and create a controlled access area underneath us so that stuff's not, one, falling on the people below, or I can put in fencing or meshing along the outside edges to protect stuff from falling over, or I can install toe boards to keep those things from falling off that are on our platform that we're working from. But again, they very highly encourage proper housekeeping on these scaffolds throughout the duration of this job. Specific scaffold requirements and specific scaffold requirements start to dive into the aerial lifts and the scissor lifts, man lifts, and I might have made an error in what I said there about scissor lifts. Scissor lifts you can operate on with just the guardrails being in place. Scissor lifts, again, only move vertically, and you can operate on those with just the guardrails in place. You don't need to wear any type of fall protection or fall arrest systems on scissor lifts. You do have to wear them on aerial lifts or man lifts. It is a requirement, either a personal fall arrest system or the other one there. So the aerial lift, which we'll dive into next week, the aerial lift itself has some new operator training that's required, some new operator and supervisor requirements that are out there, as well as some new inspection criteria for those aerial lifts and man lifts. And we'll get into those more next week. What I would like to do, any questions? I've kind of been rambling fast here and I'm sorry. Any questions? Not hearing any? Do I even have anybody still with me? Ed, how are you doing? Okay. Hey, Matt, Carl, any questions out there? Matt probably doesn't.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, any questions on any of this?
Well, not so far. Okay.
Okay. The kind of it kind of the whole scaffolding thing really is on a generally on a base by base or a case by case basis here, and generally in how you set them up on your sites and how you're doing. They spell out some very basic rules of how we're going to handle this scaffolding. And again, probably the biggest intent is the inspection process to make sure they're inspected, and then we get into the other 2 or 3 processes, i.e. the guardrail piece and proper use of it. I've tried to spell that out. The we hit in our quick talk there we hit the scope, we hit 451 and 452, the different controls and whatnot. And then again, records. If we're inspecting scaffolds, those records have to be kept for a year. And I said if, and I should not have. You have to inspect them during each shift, prior to each shift, prior to allowing people to go on them. And it's got to be I say a paper. Matt Carl's going to argue with me and say we do ours by a data stream or by eye safety or something like that. That's all acceptable as long as we save that and hang on to that for a year, so that if it is ever a question, we can go back and show inspection forms and what was identified and what wasn't. So again, that can come in there. Also, your training is initial training. We have to do initial training for those people working on scaffold and those people erecting and dismantling scaffold. And then we have to do it based on an evaluation, probably on a yearly basis, refreshing people. And then anytime we see people operating outside the safe parameters of those scaffolds. So we have to do that. Scaffold, basic, 3 types. The supported scaffolds, which is what we tend to use more than anything. And then the suspended scaffolds, those drop scaffolds that are on 2 ropes or 3 ropes, 4 ropes, whatnot. And then aerial lifts, which again we'll get into next week in some detail. Supported scaffold, generally what we are using, platform rigidly supported by load-bearing members such as legs, posts, frames, and we see a good piece of that right there. And we see the use of that outrigger, and that outrigger being that 3 inches away from the wall, and how we use that. And there's a suspended platform, suspension platform. And then vehicle mounted aerial lifts, vehicle mounted device used to elevate workers to job sites above the ground. These type may not be used. Shore scaffold or lean-to scaffolds can't be used, and we wouldn't be using those, and can't be built. Falling's the leading cause of death in the construction industry. Again, leading cause of death, leading cause of injuries, and generally it's from lack of fall protection systems being in place on these scaffolds, or slipping and tripping. And again, that housekeeping piece on those platforms that we're working from, very important. And then improper means of climbing on or off, using the frame to climb, or climbing the cross beams, and then planks or platforms that fail because of overloading. And remember, when we're figuring our load on those planks or platforms, we're not only figuring the load we're going to put up there, but we have to include the load of the people working from that platform as well, or from that plank as well. And then improper construction. And again, when I say if we're using planking, always set that planking up in the same direction, the overlaps in the same direction. You also have to, I mentioned, and I think most of us just run the 6-foot rule, but I did mention scaffold has a 10-foot fall protection requirement, but most of us run that 10-foot rule anyway. And a competent person determines fall protection method, the best way to do this. And plank or deck all platforms between the front uprights and the guardrails. So each working deck, each working area on that platform has to be fully planked from front to back. Fully planked, and gaps of 1 inch or less. Protect yourself. Scaffold platforms, walkways have to be at least 18 inches wide. We hit on that. And use a ramp, ladder, or other access point when scaffolds 2 feet, where there's a break in elevation within those scaffolds of 2 feet or greater. and never use cross braces as a means of access, and never use scaffolds in bad weather, slippery, ice, snow. Let's clear them before we go, and let's make sure we have a identifier, i.e. an inspection that shows that. And then falling, as I mentioned earlier, the aerial lift piece, personal fall arrest system, a crawling board, chicken ladder, personal fall arrest system, or a grab line, vertical lifeline, that type of stuff. Self-contained scaffolds, again, guardrail system, frame, guardrail system, personal fall arrest with the vertical ropes. You never tie back or you never tie onto a scaffold itself. And I mentioned the electrical hazards. Overhead power lines present a serious risk, and again, we're at that 10-foot mark. Scaffolds and workers should be kept 10 feet away from those overhead lines or power entrances. And then hazards of scaffolds. Again, employees must wear hard hats on a scaffold. You got to wear hard hats on a scaffold. We've got to create a controlled access area underneath, controlled access zone, CAZ, underneath this scaffold, in and around it, to forbid entry and to keep things from falling on our fellow workers down there. Panel screens, if any material on the platform is stacked higher than the toe board. Again, anytime I stack higher than a toe board, then I've got to have some type of screenage on that back side or front side. Build a canopy, erect a net below the scaffold that will contain, deflect falling objects. Protect employees from falling objects by toe board screens, guardrails, debris nets, catch platforms, canopies. Canopies we generally use in and around the public. And then training, we hit on training. Each employee who performs work on a scaffold must be trained in the electrical hazards, those fall hazards, wearing fall protection or using fall protection properly, and then the maintenance and assembly of fall protection systems, and then the handling of materials on scaffolds, and the capacity and maximum intended load of that scaffold. And that today brings us through our scaffolding piece, and it's been nice having you. I'll remind you that next week we will be discussing MWAPs, mobile elevated work platforms. We'll go through that, the new operator standard, the new company standard, and the new training standards for mobile elevated work platforms. Short of that, are there any questions out there at this point? Short of that, any questions? Bill, we okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
Okay. Ed, James? I guess with that, we'll call it a day. I appreciate you all showing up this morning, sharing this insight with me, and we will be back at you next Monday morning at 7 o'clock. I would plan about an hour and a half next Monday morning over the mobile elevated work platforms, and pass the word along. If anybody else would like to join us, they're more than welcome to. Thank you all for joining us for another of the AGC Vermont Spring Safety Series. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thanks.